I'm here today with Kathryn Perrin Cosper, better known as Candy. Candy's worked as a writer in marketing, communications, and development for businesses and nonprofit organizations for more than 30 years, retiring as a grant writer in Charlotte, North Carolina. We're here to talk about her most recent book, which is called The Defense Rests, Lessons Learned Through Illness and Grief. But previous to that, she wrote another book called Covenant Presbyterian Church, The First 50 Years. She was born in Greensboro, North Carolina, attended Randolph-Macon Women's College, and graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Phi Beta Kappa. She's a widow, mother of 3 children, and a grandmother, and she lives in Charlotte. So Candy, it's so wonderful to have you here with us today.
So great to be here with you, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So this is a really interesting book that you wrote that talks a lot about your husband's illness and death and, you know, everything that surrounded all of that. So maybe you could kind of first give us more background on, you know, what led up to all of that.
I would love to. My husband and I met in college, and I helped put him through law school. And I wrote for a long time for a number of nonprofits while he had a legendary career as a defense attorney specializing in medical malpractice defense. And this is important given the fact that he ended up with a lot of medical issues and knew most of the people who cared for him. We were going to just have this wonderful life on the NC coast after retirement, and we had a lot of fun. I'd been writing all my life, from the corny, girlish poems and melodramatic stories of middle school to stories of United Way agencies, countless hardships of other people. And people kept asking me when I was going to write a book, but I was busy and I didn't feel that I had a personal story to tell. But then when he got into his 60s, just when the rest of the family was getting settled and we were looking towards maybe retirement in a few years, my husband had a lot of medical problems and he suddenly had a stroke. And all of a sudden I was caring for him 24/7. Eventually even had to find another place for him to live. And he died on our 45th wedding anniversary. And there it was. After all those years of writing about other people, I had a story to tell. And so sort of the writer and the story came together, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, from what I can gather, it was quite a, you know, trying time, you know, so, but tell us a little bit more about, you know, why you had to write the book, you know, what's unique about the book and about your story. I mean, a lot of people pass away, right? I mean, and their spouses have to care for them. But, you know, tell us a little bit about the uniqueness of your story.
You were so right. I think though all of our experiences are our own, and each one of us is living a unique story, the story of the defense rest is really not particularly unique. People have struggles and illnesses and terrible tragedies every day. 2020 showed us, and we continue to live that. One quote that I start with in my book is, this is from C.S. Lewis, is, "The great thing, if one can, is to stop regarding all the unpleasant things as interruptions in one's own life or real life. The truth is, of course, that interruptions are precisely one's real life, the life to which God calls us every day." Anyway, there were so many things that I didn't know ahead of time that I was unprepared for. And I learned so much during that time that I wrote the book that I wish that I had read before everything happened to us. Life is going to change for everybody, and eventually it's going to involve dramatic illness, loss, death. Most people have already gone through that or will go through that. And what I realized during my struggle was that I didn't have any idea what I was doing as a caregiver, and that a lot of people just didn't know what to say and do for us. They wanted to. whenever anyone gets sick, there is like, we are all interconnected and none of us lives in a vacuum. And there's the patient, the caregiver, the partner or spouse, the parent, the child, the friend, the coworker. And I wanted to address everyone with, I wanted to sort of put it all in one place within the context of our story. I think Jesus spoke in parables for a reason. And so I didn't want my story to be just a bunch of lists to say what to say or what not to say to people, how to react when somebody goes in the hospital. I wanted all that to be in there, but I wanted to tell it in the context of a real story. Because even while we can't necessarily know how someone else feels, our stories help us to build compassion. So I hope that this book is turning out to be a good resource for people. But most importantly, I hope it's inspiring people to, as Frederick Buechner says, listen to your own life. He says there is no event so commonplace that God is present within it, always leaving you room to recognize him or not recognize him. And I just started realizing how many moments in which we had started to recognize God. So that's kind of how the book came about.
Wow. Well, I love that Buechner quote, of course. So in addition to the actual story, you include a lot of, themes that you talk about: resilience in the face of hardship, gratitude, compassion, humor, etc. Did you intentionally set about to include those things in your book, or how did that come about?
Well, that's very interesting. I ended up having to rewrite the book after my children read it, because during the time that my husband's name was Harvey, during the time that Harvey was so sick, and that was 2 years and 8 months of just constantly one thing after another. During that time, I was sending emails to our friends, sort of like a caring bridge or, a blog, and put some of them on Facebook. And people kept saying, oh, my goodness, you should write a book, because my husband was quite funny. We do a lot of laughing in our family. So the emails were entertaining, but they were also poignant, and they made for a good story. And so I put all of them together, and I kind of put a narrative around it, and I sent it to my kids to look at. And I need to tell you that although my daughter Facebook posts are a great addition to the book, which if you read it, you know, she still can't read it all the way through. Still too sad, but the book is not totally sad. So my sons came back to me and they said, Mom, we know you, and this book isn't you. You are being so careful not to talk about yourself, and you haven't realized perhaps that you're one of the two main characters in the book, and it needs to be more honest. They said this in a very kind and gentle way. I had so put off as a writer, I was so used to not writing from my own point of view, my own self, but writing about other people, that it came across as shallow and skeletal and perhaps a little phony or something. So I actually went back, took the same framework, and I worked all around there to put myself and my feelings, my failures, my weaknesses, as well as what I saw as my strengths, and put them all into the book. And and then my favorite quotes. I went back through and I put a favorite quote, put them at the beginning of each of the however many 18 chapters or whatever. And what happened was it drove my book designer crazy, particularly in trying to get an ebook laid out. But I think it really worked out much better in the long run. And when I returned it, my two sons looked at the book, and neither one of them had a change to make. They both said, this is real.
Wow.
This
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So not only the story, you also have some practical things in there like lists and, advice and suggestions and things like
Yes.
that, right?
I was really careful about that. Last week, I did a talk for a large group of attorneys, for example, and in order to get credit for this on their mental health continuing legal education, they needed to have handouts. It was required, and I was very reticent to say, okay, here's a list of what not to say to somebody when they going through a hard time. Here's a list of what to do. Here's a list of practical things to do as soon as someone dies. There are 8 practical tasks that you need to do right away. Here's a list of resources for people who are going through grief. I have all of that in the book. I have a lot of really helpful lists and resources. But as I said earlier about talking about the idea of parables or the idea of writing within a story, I think my main goal was not that everybody would start saying all the same things to people who are going through a hard time, although that was important, that people say sort of things that are helpful and not things that are guilt-inducing or unhelpful, but that people find a way to compassion for themselves and compassion for others who are going through real struggles. So, I think I started looking at resilience, for example, and I could put a list of what people find are resilient. The New York Times a few months ago had the results of 50 years of studies on what makes us resilient. And they listed things like optimism, religious, spiritual beliefs, of having a positive but realistic outlook, having a sense of mission or purpose, the ability to see ourselves in a greater context, and a sense of social support, all those things. But to put out a list of that doesn't really help us as much as, for example, reading about a real human being and how that person dug down and figured out how to get up in the morning, how to get through the dark woods, how to find comfort and strength within himself or herself during the worst times.
Wow.
So I think it's different for all of us.
But it's really nice that you include both kind of the personal elements as well as the practical elements. I think that's really a nice mix. And helpful.
I learned a great deal from my husband, Brian. And this is what I think one thing that motivated me to write the book as much as anything else is that I actually saw it in person. I don't want to blow him up. He wasn't perfect. And yet he's lying there in a bed, for example, he's got a feeding tube, he's partially paralyzed, he's had falls, broken bones, surgeries, he's lost his career. And yet, from the very first day in the ICU, he's joking around with everybody. The nurses are trying to get him up to stand, and he's connected with his IV, and he says, "Oh, look, I'm pole dancing." Or a nurse came in and said, "Now, Mr. Cosper, we need you to try, one more time to stand up by yourself, and then I promise you that you can lie down and get a rest." And he said, "I don't negotiate with terrorists." These are things that he did all the time. The hashtag dad quotes that run all the way through the defense rest are very funny. Some are barely publishable, but just very funny. Another thing that he did that I learned, it's very important, is that he deflected attention from himself to others in a very healthy way. If you ask him about himself, he would briefly answer you, but he wanted to know about you. And his sense of gratitude. I would be coming in early in the morning, having spent the night at home and done all the things that were going on in the house that needed to be done. And I would walk in to his room in whatever place he was incarcerated, as he used to say, he was incarcerated in a number of places. I'd say, "What you doing?" He said, "I'm just lying here thinking about how blessed we are."
Wow.
He really meant that. And then he would say, "Honey, come over here. I want you to meet. This is Sharon. She's been my nurse all night. She has a 2-year-old who, and would go on and on about the people who cared for him."
Well, good for him. To be able to have that kind of attitude in that type of situation is really admirable and wonderful, right? I mean, that had to help.
There's one story that I always want to tell when I'm talking about the book, because I think it is really a central story in the book. The last year of his life, Harvey had to move out of the house. He was hospitalized probably 8 or 10 times. He had a really difficult time, eventually was not able to even sit up. And yet we didn't expect him to die. So the last night that I saw him, I said good night, kissed him goodbye. I told him the next day was our 45th anniversary. And he said what he has always said for 45 years, which was, "Oh, good, we can all line up and have root canals in honor of the occasion." And then I went home. 3:00 in the morning, I got a call that he had died. And when my older son and I got home that next morning, about 8:00 in the morning, we ate breakfast, and then a flower truck, delivery truck, pulled up in front of the house. And my son said, "I'll go out and get him." I said, "I know what that is." We got more flower trucks during the day, but the guy got out with a vase full of long stem red roses. Harvey always sent me red roses
Oh my.
from the Blossom Shop on our anniversary.
Oh my.
And sure enough, he had gotten our daughter, because he couldn't do it, to order them, use his credit card, and send me the flowers.
Wow.
And my son went out, and Harvey would have just loved this. He would have loved it. The young man handed my son the vase of flowers. My son said, "Let me take them in. Those are for my mom, for my dad. And he just died a few hours ago." The young man hands the flowers to my son, and he turns back to get in the van, and he says, "Well, y'all have a great day."
Wow.
Which is another example of how people don't always listen. They don't always know what to say. And do you know that when my son brought those flowers back into the house, I opened up the card and it said, "Thanks for another great year, sweetheart. All my love, Harvey."
Hmm.
How he could have called that a great year, I have no idea. But great was capitalized. And that is just the way he thought, because he felt that he had everything that was really important in life. And so that is another reason that I wrote this book, is I wanted to talk about, we can't get ready for all the bad things that are going to happen to us in life. But one thing that we can do is we can work on deflecting, and we can work on humor. We can work on our faith, and we can work on gratitude. And I feel that if we could just do those things, we can almost be ready for anything.
So another topic that you talk about in the book is hope. Hope is a future looking concept. So that's obviously a difficult thing to do when you're in the midst of all the suffering or after someone has passed. So tell us a little bit about what you wrote about on that topic.
It's so much easier to see where God is present and working in our lives in retrospect. We can look back and see this was, a God moment, or this is where we were led. So many things happened to us in those several years. and before and since, but in particular, that nugget of time. Um, and I began to see that hope was not just hoping for something concrete to happen. All this time, I had prayed, I had hoped, I had wanted Harvey to get better. I wanted to get back to the life we always had. And when I realized one day I was at I was getting my hair cut. Actually, I had to get somebody to stay with Harvey because he could never be left alone. And I got a telephone call from his physical therapist. And she said, I may be out of line in telling you this because I know that for the last 2 years, you've been hoping that your husband will get better. But I want to tell you that in the months since I last cared for him, and now he's my patient again, he has greatly deteriorated. And whether the doctors have told you this or not, he is in the end stage. Wow. That was hard to hear.
Sure.
And so I didn't know how to feel about that. I started thinking about how I had so hoped that he would get better. And I realized that I was going to have to redefine what hope meant for us and for me. And as it happens, not only was that, I think, a divinely inspired call, it had to have been very hard for her to do that. When I got back to the nursing home where he was stuck, I got a call from one of the ministers of our church. And I told her about the call. And she said, you know, all this time you've been focusing on getting Harvey back to the way he was physically, but perhaps now is a good time to think about who he is, his mind, his heart, the essence of him, and to be looking at that and to be appreciating that and to be hoping for appreciation for all that he is and has been. And at first I didn't like that, but the more I thought about it, the more important it became. So for the last, actually, he lived almost another year after that. And for that last year, I stopped pushing him to try harder and to get better and to try to walk and all those things. And I tried to just enjoy the life that we had left. And what I was able to hope for then was much more important than what I had hoped for before. It expanded my whole idea of what hope is.
Wow. Well, good for you. Talk about, creating lemonade out of lemons.
I wasn't always really good at all those things. It was not necessarily in my nature to be. I think in a lot of ways I was a really good caregiver because I'm kind of energetic and feisty and organized. But I'm also not real gentle and patient. And those were things that I was called on to learn.
I can only imagine.
Our minister said yesterday in our Lenten service, I'm going to read this out. On this day, we are reminded that humankind has its limits. And within those limits, we're invited to live life to the fullest. And that means a lot to me because I feel like when I'm thinking about hope, I had to sort of limit what I was hoping for, but then that opened it up for me to hope for even more important things, if that makes sense.
Wow. So just from a practical standpoint, you had the pleasure of trying to introduce a book during the pandemic.
Oh my goodness.
It's got to be one of the most challenging things for people to try to do. How's it been received so far?
Well, that's interesting. I decided rather than get an agent, I would publish the book myself and market it myself. And I had all these signing events and, college reunions. And then the book came out in March 2020.
Wow.
It's the
Perfect timing.
Worst possible time. So, but I've really enjoyed the Zooming with people. I really hate that I can't meet them in person. I hate that you and I can't be talking in person, but we're face to face. And what's been really wonderful is that people, I think, have probably made more of an effort to write to me. And the number of people I've heard from, the way they've connected with the book has been so different. For some people, it was, oh, thank you so much for giving me you gave me permission to be who I am, to grieve in the way that I personally need to grieve and not to be judged on that. People can come up to you and say, why are you still wearing your wedding band? Or why are you not still wearing your wedding band? Or, they don't mean it, but we each can claim for ourselves our own way of going through hard times, of dealing and grieving. And then I've heard from the lawyers I talked to last week, several of them said, we tend to be very focused and compartmentalized. And I realized that I have shut out sort of that feeling part, and I lost my grandfather to COVID and I sort of had to come back to work and compartmentalize. And it's made me less of maybe a helpful partner, a helpful friend. My husband used to say, never let your quest for perfection interfere with your ability to do good. And I think that's been true with having a book during the pandemic. In a way, it was a hard time to do it from the standpoint of the person who wants people to read her book. But it's actually been a good time because so many people now are bringing out, I'm sad. I feel grief. I feel torn. I feel disconnected. I will say one more thing, Brian, that in 50 years of research on resilience, the number one finding for effective resilience is social connectedness. And the ways that we are now finding to be socially connected and thanks to your technology, people can stay connected with other writers, with other progressive Christians, with others of many faiths. I think within those constrictions, we're finding a lot of creative and effective ways to be connected with one another. And this can only be good in building our compassion.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it's broken down barriers, geographical barriers and barriers to meeting each other. You don't have to be in the same physical place but yet it's effective, and people feel like they're actually just talking in person, not, over the phone or something. So I did one more thing.
Oh, I'm sorry. I did one more thing that was probably not very well advised, but turned out to be fine, is helping to start an SOS group, which is Surviving Our Spouses at my church. We have over 100 widows and widowers in the church. So we've started a group, and the only time we were ever able to meet in person was we had an outdoor picnic with masks staying, socially distanced back in the summer. But we're trying to be there for one another in fellowship and friendship and respond to people who experience the death of a spouse.
Wonderful. Well, good for you. Good for you. Well, Candy, thanks so much for sharing your book and your story and, all of your life with us. It's been so good to learn about. And just to remind people, the name of the book is The Defense Rests, Lessons Learned Through Illness and Grief. And you can order it online. Kathy's website is Kathryn, Kathryn, Cosper, COSPER.com. So Candy, thanks again for joining us. Really great to learn your story and be able to share it with folks.
Brian, thank you so much for having me. And I wish the best to everyone, particularly those who are going through the tough times. We can be there for each other. That's the most important thing.
Amen. Thank you.